Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Anut Naushan, Project Manager of Courage to Act. Courage to Act is a 2-year national initiative to address and prevent gender-based violence in post-secondary campuses in Canada. It builds on the key recommendations within Possibility Seed's final report, Courage to Act, developing a national framework to prevent and address gender-based violence at post-secondary institutions. Courage to Act is the first national collaborative of its kind to bring together experts and advocates from across Canada to end gender-based violence on campus. A key feature of our project is our free webinar series, where we invite leading experts to discuss key concepts and share promising practices on ending gender-based violence on campus. And now, on behalf of our whole team, I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar. And before I introduce our speakers today, a brief note on the format. Farrah, CJ, and Robyn will speak for 40 to 45 minutes, and I invite you to enter questions and comments into the question and answer box, and I will monitor this, and together we will pose these questions to our speakers at the end of the presentation. This will happen in the last 15 minutes of the presentation. And at the end of the webinar, you will find a link to the evaluation form. We'd be grateful if you take a few moments to share your feedback as it helps us improve. This is anonymous. Following the webinar, I will also email you a copy of the evaluation form and a link to the recording so that you can review the webinar and share with your networks. We're lucky to have our webinar series supported by Caucus. These webinars are a recognized learning opportunity. And attendance at 10 or more webinars will count towards an online certificate. Our project is made possible through support and funding from the Department for Women and Gender Equality Wage, Federal Government of Canada. And as we begin by acknowledging that this work is taking place on and across the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations. We recognize that gender-based violence is one form of violence caused by colonization that is used to marginalize and dispossess Indigenous peoples from their lands and their waters. Our work strives to honor this truth as we work towards decolonizing this work and actualizing justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women across the country. And I want to take a moment here to invite our panelists and our attendees to take a deep breath, because this work is challenging and it is hard. And many of us find ourselves in this work because of our own experience of survivorship, of supporting those we love and care about who have experienced gender-based violence. So just a kind reminder to be attentive to our well-being as we listen and have these hard conversations. And now I want to take a moment to quickly introduce our speakers today. Farrah Khan spent 2 decades working diligently to raise awareness about the connection between equity and gender-based violence through education, resource creation, and project management. She's the manager of Consent Comes First, Office of Sexual Violence Support and Education at Ryerson University. Farrah is the founder of Possibility Seeds Consulting and is a member of the Government of Canada's Federal Strategy Against Gender-Based Violence Advisory Council. Farrah is also the recipient of numerous awards, including the Toronto Community Foundation's Vital People Award. And for nearly 20 years, CJ Rowe has worked with organizations developing educational campaigns and research projects. Presently, CJ is a director of Simon Fraser University's Sexual Violence Support and Prevention Office, supporting individuals impacted by sexual violence while developing prevention and intervention educational campaigns. CJ will be leading the creation of the education toolkit for this project. And Robyn Bidgood is an alumnus of Ryerson University and has also worked with the Ryerson Residence Life Staff Team and in the Office of Sexual Violence Support and Education. With this experience, Robyn joined the Possibility Seeds team as one of the lead researchers. She has coordinated consultations with advocates and educators from across Canada and conducted research on best practices on sexual violence policies in institutions across North America. She uses research to develop the recommendations in the Reporting, Investigation, and Adjudications chapter of the Courage to Act report. Now it's my pleasure to turn it over to our speakers.
Hi, good morning. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the creation of the Courage to Act report. Report is a pretty large project that we took on, and it was a 7-person project team. And together with the 7-person project team, we had a 29-person advisory committee made up of folks from across Canada, including administrators, presidents of universities and colleges, student activists, community members that were working on issues of gender-based violence in organizations, as well as ourselves. And we really looked at this issue together and looked at how in a year's time we could actually create a report that spoke to the far-reaching issues that were happening on campuses. We did 30 listening and learning consultations where we actually created opportunities for people to come together under different issues and concerns. So things like talking about folks that did frontline work with GBV survivors, to people doing work with folks that were experiencing harm, to people that were experiencing harm themselves, so survivors. And we looked at how they were seeing promising practices happening on their campuses and also gaps that they were seeing. And with those 30 listening and learning sessions, we actually talked to 300 plus people from across Canada, and they were amazing. We heard conversations from folks talking about what was happening in Indigenous communities on campuses, to Black individuals on campuses, to talking to people of color, to seeing what people with disabilities were experiencing in terms of accessing support. We talked to folks that were talking with community members on how they weren't going to report or how they were reporting and how the challenges and also the good things that were happening. Out of those conversations came 45 recommendations, and those 45 recommendations are built on promising practices that are already happening in universities and colleges and CJEBs, as well as things that weren't happening. And people were saying, you know, these would be really interesting to see happen yet. And also we saw in the conversations over 60 representatives from post-secondary institutions. So the project itself really came together from hearing and listening and looking at what our community was already saying and building on those recommendations. The next slide will talk more about what we mean by gender-based violence. So before I get to what we mean by gender-based violence, I'm first going to talk about the Courage to Act report. And the Courage to Act report was really put into 2 major far-reaching parts at the beginning. And we looked at what we needed to talk about across campuses. So one of the first ones we talked about was implementing existing Indigenous-led solutions. So ensuring that we're listening and we're actually implementing what has already been named by Indigenous communities on what needs to happen to address gender-based violence and to actually address colonization on campuses. The second part was actually utilizing a trauma-informed approach. So how are we actually going to create spaces where are safe for survivors and safe for everyone that's experienced trauma? The third was supporting the leadership of student survivors, researchers, and activists, recognizing that they have been at the forefront of these conversations. The fourth was work with a broader movement to end gender-based violence, recognizing the work to end gender-based violence has been occurring for decades in this country, and actually since the inception of this country by Indigenous communities. The fifth was develop and implement measurements, evaluation, and climate surveys to ensure that we understand what we're actually addressing in the scope and breadth and depth. And the sixth, was actually looking at how do we centralize data collection? What do we need to collect and how do we need to know this? On the next slide, we'll talk about the second part. So the second part of the beginning of the report, we talked about how we have to mandate a policy creation and review process. So ensuring that we know how we're going to create the policy review process is very important for us. Also aligning intersection of PSI policies. So knowing that we have multiple PSI policies that intersect with each other, how are they working together and not working against each other? The third was implementing an intersectional equity approach, recognizing that we don't live single issue lives, as Audre Lorde says, and to ensure that we're actually holding space to the multiplicity of our experiences as survivors, complainants, respondents, and as people doing the work. Also fourth was committing to sustainable funding, recognizing that this is not a trend or a flash in the pan, but this is actually something that we need to treat as a sustainable conversation and something that needs sustainable funding to make it work. The fifth was creating a long-term gender equity strategy for PSIs to ensure that we recognize that to address gender-based violence, we have to actually deal with the root causes of it. And lastly, we said to enact an oversight mechanisms with Indigenous, provincial, territorial, and federal or federal governments, recognizing that we need the support of all parties involved to ensure that this actually gets addressed. So a lot of times when the conversation is about gender-based violence, people are like, what? I mean, the focus should be about sexual violence. That's what we've all been talking about at universities and colleges and CJIPs. But actually expanding that definition to look at gender-based violence allows people coming forward to have all their needs met. Oftentimes, as a frontline worker, I'll have a survivor come to my office and they'll say, you know what, I'm in a partner abusive relationship. There hasn't been sexual assault yet, but there has been physical violence. Can I utilize your services? Now, if we look at how policies are often written, usually they can't if the policy says really explicitly, we're only looking at sexual violence. So really, we saw right from the start, from the conversations we were having in our listening and learning sessions, that we need to expand what we're looking at on campuses to things like physical abuse, spiritual abuse, financial abuse, harassment and stalking, online violence, technological facilitated violence, sexual violence, emotional and psychological abuse. All of these things impact the way people listen, learn, and work and feel safe to do working and studying on our campuses. On the next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the support and response section. So the support and response was the first area that we looked at on the report. On to the next slide, I'll talk more about kind of the pieces that we saw. So the first section we looked at was responding to disclosures of gender-based violence. What we saw is that there's an importance to establish a coordinated response team. So that means multiple members of the campus response group coming together to actually address an issue. The second one is ensuring that every door is an open door, recognizing the fact that survivors and people that have experienced harm or people that have caused harm might go to multiple members of the campus community and not go to the office that is specifically for this. So ensuring that everyone knows what to do and is aware of the policy and knows what to do with disclosures is paramount. Thirdly, it's important to promote the rights of people affected by gender-based violence, so people know that they have the right to make a complaint, that they won't be penalized for their school, that they will be able to access services are all really important. And this is a really important point that was raised by the Black, Indigenous, and people of color listening and learning participant. No matter who you are on campus, you know you should be aware of what the process is when it comes to gender-based violence, like how to deal with disclosure or how to deal with them when a person is reporting, because that will ensure that every individual is equipped with how to handle at least the first part of a situation. Next slide. It's also important to understand the scope and limits of confidentiality. This is a very important piece, as people sometimes will wonder if they can tell someone, how they can tell someone. Will my family know? Will my community know? Will my classmates know? Will my coworkers know? And this was really raised in the international students listening and learning session. For an international student, they often believe immigration is the law and the process of PR, permanent residence, could entail lifting confidentiality. Ideally, in policies, it will explicitly state that immigration law would or would not apply to make clear for many students. This would lift a major stigma. There is also no language in the preamble around cultural safety and support for either the survivor or the respondent. Next slide. Also, confidentiality speaks to rural and remote communities. It was raised by a senior administrator and our listening and learning participant how important it is that at every level that people have to know what confidentiality is. It's important to respect nationhood and communities who will have a different process for dealing with gender-based violence. There's a difference between institutional reality of our policies and how they apply to communities. And it was brought up also in the Quebec region, listening and learning participant, about confidentiality in comparison to universities and colleges which are small or large. In a university of 40,000 people, it might be easy to handle, but in a CEGEP of 200 people, where everyone knows each other, it's much harder. Next slide. Also, maintaining a trauma-responsive campus was raised as a very important piece. And nobody, I think, raises this better than Dr. Sarah Hunt in decolonizing the roots of rape culture. So as we have conversations on campus about sexual violence, we must remember that Indigenous people enter into the space, staff, students, and faculty, with an existing relationship to rape culture. Sexual violence is just one manifestation of the continuum of violence wrought by settler colonialism. Indigenous women, Two-Spirit people, trans and queer people have been resisting colonial rape culture for years, mourning our loved ones whose lives have been taken in a country in which their deaths are treated as unexceptional. Responding to disclosures of gender-based violence also includes in clarifying the role of security and police, ensuring that everyone knows what their role is and how they do their work. It also is establishing protocols and processes for community safety alerts, so ensuring that everyone knows how we discuss these issues in a community way. But lastly, working with community media and campus and public relations to ensure communication is key and clear. One of the things was raised by Black and people of color listening and learning session participant was having RCMP, campus police, or campus security be the first point of contact when it comes to disclosing or reporting doesn't necessarily make sense all the time. It may not work for certain communities and may not meet the needs of survivors or people that have been hurt. Next slide. And now we're going to the second section. So support for people affected by gender-based violence. There's importance to increase access to support service to ensure that everyone is able to meet the needs that they have. Secondly, is commitment to accessible support services, to ensuring that people with disabilities have access to services that meet their needs and are safe for them. Lastly, clearly defining the scope of the policy. As one person brought up in the union listening and learning participant, often policies on sexual violence are primarily focused on student survivors disclosing, and sometimes that are separate policies for faculty, or they don't always mesh well together. And it's important to think about who the policies are supporting. We really urge people to think that everyone needs to be included under these policies, staff, faculty, and students. Next slide. Support for people affected by gender-based violence also includes ensuring broad workplace accommodations, providing comprehensive and academic considerations and accommodations, and establishing a centralized support office. One thing was raised too is that students who experience effects of intergenerational trauma, residential schools, how they impact learning, especially in class when learning about colonization, and then the students are not aware that they can reach out for support. Getting accommodations for students is very hard and very complex, and it's important for a policy to respond to how the student experiences the effect of trauma rather than focusing on what has happened and who it has happened to. Next slide. Support for people affected by gender-based violence also includes utilizing the experience and expertise of people leading on the work on campus. So ensuring the people that you've hired to do this work that are experts in the field are leading that conversation. Secondly, it's also supporting student-led centers, organizing, and peer support programming. We've seen exceptional work happening by students across this country, students' unions, grassroots student movements. We need to support them and make sure that they're heard and believed. And that was really raised in the Our Turn, a national student-led action plan to end campus sexual violence in 2017. They raised the importance that there needs to be student-led supports, because access to support networks independent of institutions may be helpful to many survivors as they pursue recovery. This can be done either through the creation of an independent student sexual violence support center or the creation of an informal survivor network. Next slide. The other piece is, of course, is to collaborate with external community partners. There has been a huge movement to end gender-based violence in Canada, and we have to ensure that those community organizations are compensated, heard, and supported. What was raised by a senior administrator in a listening and learning session was that we are not working in a bubble, with these gender-based violence issues. We're working with a very complex and intersecting efforts, such as those addressing missing and murdered Indigenous girls and women. It is very real here. And also what was raised in the support and response section was how to have actual commitments to organizations to have a contract with sexual assault centers and ensure that they're on campus 5 days a week, providing longer-term trauma counseling to survivors, which is really helpful. Ensuring that those community groups are there allows for a continuation of care, and also puts the onus on the community to create space that welcomes in community organizations. Next slide. Lastly, one of the big issues that was raised in the support and response section was how we support respondents. There's a gap in the terms of supporting respondents, and it was raised by the support and response listening and learning session. There's a gap in the terms of supporting respondents through the reporting process, and because of the lack of support, the respondents circle back to our office and we are already supporting the complainant. So support for respondents can look like help in understanding their rights, explaining and helping navigate investigation and adjudication processes, referral to campus and community resources, and organizing an interpreter or translator if needed, and other support as needed. Next slide. And lastly, it's also supporting people who've caused harm. There are people who've caused harm that are suspended from school, and that's a case where you go through the process of getting arrested. That doesn't actually solve anyone's problems, it creates more. I would argue, says the Black and people of color listening and learning participant, that doesn't actually solve any problems. I would argue more barriers, more intentions, and it still doesn't deal with the harm or trauma in the situation. Another listening and learning respondent in the response and support section said, I'd love to see somehow in the policy, it's kind of reframing supporting respondents and people who have caused harm as a survivor-centric practice. Thank you so much for listening to the report and response section.
I'd like to take a few moments now to introduce you to some of the key highlights outlined in the education chapter of the Courage to Act report. If we go to the next slide, I'd like to share with you a key quote that arose during one of the listening and learning sessions. And for me, this quote really helps to ground the work that's articulated in this chapter. One listening and learning participant from the students group shared, having and holding space for education and training is key. It needs to be ongoing and mandatory, multimodal, and builds upon what has already been learned. It's a continual process. Thinking about this quote as a key place for us to move forward, when we move to the next slide, I'll share with you the theoretical model in which this work is situated upon. So to help us understand and outline some of the key approaches to gender-based violence prevention education, we've drawn upon the social ecological model to frame our work. Research shows that this model is one of the most effective approaches to creating lasting social change. It also takes into account that there are a multitude of factors that shape human behavior. So when we look at the prevention education needed at our post-secondary institutions, we should be looking at creating and supporting conversations and learning opportunities that meet people on a multitude of levels. It could be individual, it could be relationship, it could explore community needs, societal pieces, including changing norms, as well as structural barriers. All of these pieces are core in terms of us affecting social change. 6 major components that need to be woven in here as well that predict the success of programming and should be taken into account when we create and support the execution of gender-based violence education are the following 6 components. 1, they should be comprehensive. 2, they should be community engaged. 3, they should be contextualized programming. 4, they should be theory-based. 5, they should also be health and strengths-based. And 6, they should address the structural layers. So thinking about this and holding this close as we move into the next slide, I'm going to share with you the key findings from our listening and learning sessions. So 7 key buckets of findings were shared during our listening and learning sessions, and many of them interrelate and stand alongside of what came up in the supports chapter that Farrah shared with you moments ago. There were conversations around the importance of creating a central office, explicitly making a commitment to prevention education within policy, developing educational task force committees, as well as a few other that we will explore more expressly in a moment. So moving to our next slide, a really interesting conversation that arose and that many people are really keen to explore is around mandatory training. There was a lot of, actually I'd say there was a lot of excitement about the idea of integrating mandatory training into gender-based violence education, as well as there was some worry and doubt around whether this was the best way to go. Within our union listening and learning sessions, some were reluctant to think about mandatory training as they feared it might become a bit more of a checkbox activity, much like the bullying and harassment training it has in many of our provinces and territories. Others see it as a core component that needs to be integrated into the post-secondary setting. And we're really eager to learn the lessons learned from our colleagues in Quebec with the onset of Bill C-151, now that mandatory training is integrated within their systems. I think from a research standpoint, we're really curious to see how they're able to develop their training, what the impact is within the short term, medium term, and long term, and then how we can then integrate it into our approaches across the country. Another key component, which I'll share with you on the next slide, is again a conversation around the importance of building partnerships with those who are and have been integrated with and engaged with gender-based violence prevention education in our communities. So post-secondary institutions have an opportunity to support both social and cultural change by creating and maintaining meaningful ongoing learning opportunities both inside and outside of the classroom. Community and campus partners can share the support for this work. As one listening and learning participant shared in our Indigenous people session, I think again, people educating themselves and having more opportunities for folks like the Native Youth Sexual Health Network to come in and do trainings at places. I think about how much resources and money and time is put into these things. Having people who are experienced in their own lives doing these trainings is important. I think another listening and learning participant shared another quote that I wanted to highlight for you. So within our Black and people of color listening and learning session, a participant shared, I just wanted to definitely emphasize even more collaboration with students, student-run initiatives and community initiatives. I just want to underline that because it's true that there is a lot of good things happening in different communities, that working together would alleviate some of the strain that the universities might feel as far as like employing more professionals. The professionals already exist. It's just a matter of giving them access to the students and vice versa and paying for it. Within the next slide, we will dive into, I would say, which is the bulk of this chapter, which is exploring gender-based violence prevention education. What we uncovered in our research and within the conversations with our listening and learning participants is that there are 4 key components to building an institutional education and awareness plan for gender-based violence prevention. And they include 1, education around available support, resources, and policy. 2, education around relationships, consent, and boundaries. The 3rd is understanding root causes of gender-based violence, rape culture, and changing norms. And the 4th is developing programming and awareness educational opportunities such as responding to disclosures, bystander intervention, resistance training, men and masculinities in gender socialization, that will together create a comprehensive approach to gender-based violence prevention education. As a faculty and staff participant in our listening and learning session shared, we also need to build skills to let perpetrators build empathy, build accountability, and start to understand that socialization that has happened that doesn't justify the choices, but definitely brings this different type of awareness. We're looking at fleshing out education that meets the entire campus community with similar messaging, as well as developing specialized educational modules and learning opportunities for unique users, like that shared in our listening and learning session participant. The other piece that really stood out for me in our sessions was that we're looking at creating prevention education for students, staff, and faculty. Oftentimes our conversations focus on the needs for prevention education with students. But I think what became clear in our conversations was that staff and faculty also need to engage with these 4 buckets of prevention education. If we go on to the next slide, I think again what we need to recognize is that there does need to be a common base of knowledge for faculty, staff, and students. The grounds of all training should be similar and adopted for the specific communities and their roles at the institutions. We are also responsible to support education past, I would say, like a participant from our LGBTQ2S+ group shared, past the 101 stage, to be more comprehensive over time and to begin to build people's knowledge up over time. I think we'll move on to the next slide because I also think that staff and faculty have a very important role to play on prevention education. As I shared moments ago, many view prevention education as a student issue. However, it was made crystal clear that this is a campus-wide issue. Post-secondary institutions should decide on the baseline knowledge needed to support faculty and staff that meet the unique needs of their roles and responsibilities on campus. Faculty and staff also play an important role in supporting the ongoing nature of gender-based violence prevention work, and we need to invite them to engage in this work in meaningful ways by inviting them to become leaders, invite them to become spokespeople, as well as giving them leadership roles on the campus community. I think the final piece I'd like to share with you is on the next slide. And this is a piece that I think arose for Farrah, Robyn, and I, which is around assessment and evaluation. As one listening and learning participant shared, some programming is really promising, but we don't know, as we don't have the data to prove that it is having an impact on individuals and the campus. So in our report, we suggest exploring 4 key points. One is to build, assess, evaluation, and research partners with graduate students and faculty members on campus. The second is to integrate key questions into cyclical campus surveys, like those that happen annually in residence and housing. A third is to hold climate surveys, like they have done at some provincial levels. And I think we also need more data within institutions. And the fourth is to evaluate the impact of specific programs. So what is our existing programs telling us? How can we strengthen our approaches and also gain the research needed to join much broader conversations around the impacts of prevention education in our campus communities? I'm gonna hand it over to Robyn now to move us into the next chapter. Thank you.
Thanks, CJ. So I'm going to be going over the RIA complaint process. So that stands for reporting, investigations, and adjudication, because that's the main components of the process that we'll be reviewing. So into the next slide, we'll get started with this section. I just wanted to note before we got started that this section is a little bit different from the other 2 we've gone through so far. There's currently a limited amount of formal research looking at complaint processes for cases of gender-based violence at post-secondary institutions. Currently, processes are mainly based in academic student conduct processes, which don't necessarily translate to cases of gender-based violence. And this has created some systemic barriers that interfere with community members' ability to access these processes. So we're going to go through some of the recommendations that outline promising practices and areas for further research that can address some of these concerns. Something that also separates this section from the other two is that this process is based in administrative law, which requires procedural fairness. So procedural fairness safeguards the rights of participants and ensure that they receive equal treatment. This is to ensure that the decision at the end is not a biased decision, so they maintain fairness throughout the entire process. So an example of the use of procedural fairness is allowing a complainant and a respondent to have a chance to review and respond to all materials that an investigator collects before it actually goes to an adjudicator. And on the next slide, we have another guiding principle for this section, which is a trauma-informed approach, which we see with the other sections as well. We know that trauma is inherent in gender-based violence work, and it can have a short and long-term physical, emotional, spiritual, and mental health implications for all parties involved, whether that's them experience the initial trauma, re-traumatization, or vicarious trauma. It's important that we go through this work and complete this process with the understanding that this is going to affect everyone involved. In pulling these two practices together on the next slide, I also just wanted to note that a lot of times I've noticed through the research and through our listening and learning sessions, trauma-informed approaches and procedural fairness are kind of pitted against each other. One is seen as protecting the complainant and the other is protecting the respondent. But actually we can integrate these practices together to come to an even better result of this process. So for example, if we were to provide supports for everybody involved in the process, both the complainant, respondent, and staff, this can ensure that there is procedural fairness, but it's also done in a way that understands the harm that trauma can cause. So just to quickly overview the sections of the report, there are 5 major sections that I had outlined, which are reporting, investigation, adjudication, the appeal process, and I also included a section for staff that are involved in this process and looking at what supports they might need. So unfortunately, I can't go through all the recommendations, but I'm just going to pull out a few that were interesting to hear from our listening and learning sessions. So starting on the next slide with interim measures. Interim measures are a tool that is used to address safety concerns. It's to protect both parties from retaliation and to maintain the integrity of the process. So these are, as Mark says in this quote here, that it's important to clearly state that interim measures are non-disciplinary. They're only used to ensure safety for everyone involved. So it's important to implement the least disruptive measures possible because they aren't used to blame. They aren't used as a form of sanctioning. It's just to ensure that everyone is safe. So one of the resources that staff in the listening and learning sessions mentioned, that'll be on the next slide, that they were able to ensure that they're using the least disruptive measures possible was allowing the complainant and respondent to be involved in the decision-making process when determining what the measures will be, and also providing check-in opportunities with both parties to see whether these measures are actually meeting their needs or whether they're having unintended disciplinary impacts. So this is a great example of how we can implement both trauma-informed practices as well as procedural fairness because it's equal treatment of both parties, but also ensuring that it's not having disciplinary consequences for both parties. So moving on to the next session, one of the things that we spoke about was alternative resolutions. So as I mentioned before, unfortunately, as the process currently stands, there are quite a few community members that feel like they don't have access to this process, which is unfortunate, but fortunately this leaves us with space to actually look at alternative resolutions that don't focus on disciplinary sanctions and focus more on education and prevention. So Examples of these type of resolutions on the next slide are restorative justice, which draws from and is grounded in Indigenous knowledge and practice. So it centers around accountability, where the person acknowledges the harm that they've caused and their obligations to make amends. We also have transformative justice, which was created by and made for Black, Indigenous, and POC communities, as well as queer and trans communities. And it aims to prevent violence through healing, accountability, resiliency, and safety for all involved. So they focus on pulling away from disciplinary action and other forms of institutionalized violence. So moving to the next slide, as we got into the investigation section, we had a conversation around concurrent proceedings. So concurrent proceedings is when a complainant and a respondent or both are involved in a criminal proceeding as well as this complaint process at the PSI. There was a lot of questions around whether the PSI should delay the complaint process until the criminal proceeding has adjourned. I think it was determined, legally speaking, that it's in the best intentions of the PSI to delay the process because they aren't able to provide procedural fairness in the circumstance, because it deters the respondent from participating in the process, because any information used can be subpoenaed and used in the criminal proceeding. But at the same time, they could be determined to have committed gender-based violence in the PSI complaint process if they don't participate, because the weight of how guilt is determined is different in these two types of proceedings, so it puts them at a disadvantage. On the other side of things, if they were to delay the proceedings, this can take months or even years, which doesn't. Sorry about that. It doesn't support the complainant when they want to access this type of process. So whether they graduate, attend a different institution, or the respondent is no longer at the institution, they aren't able to proceed with this type of complaint process. So it's important that we balance both the needs of all the parties involved. So moving on to the next slide, we'll talk about what we talked about regarding adjudication. So we talked a lot about guidance on sanctioning. Currently, there isn't a Canadian standard on how sanctions should be determined in these processes. And this has led to a lot of inconsistencies on how sanctions are determined. So for example, at Columbia University, they had multiple circumstances where a student who had stolen a laptop received a more severe sanctioning than those who had committed sexual assault. So it's important that we develop resources and standards for staff who are coming to these decisions, so we are able to create some consistency. So on the next slide, we discussed in our listening and learning section a lot about US-based guides or matrices that staff currently use, and it helps them to standardize their decision and reflect the seriousness of gender-based violence. It also creates a sense of fairness across similar cases and incorporates progressive discipline. So it would be helpful to have similar resources available here based on Canadian standards. So moving on to the last thing that I will speak about is support for investigators and adjudicators. So as Chris Hackett says, there's a need for a greater emphasis on training and self-care, especially when we bring people onto adjudication panels or in as investigators and then expose them to the type of sensitive subject that we're dealing with gender-based violence. So it's important to consider the effects of vicarious trauma when you're working with this day in and day out, and the chances of these employees experiencing burnout. So it's important that we have supports in place for them to receive the support that they need. And it would be helpful to have research that looked at what types of supports these would be, especially if we're pulling people in from outside the institution and aren't necessarily being able to access benefits because they're on a contract with the post-secondary institution. So in conclusion, as I mentioned through most of the slides, is that there it's just a greater need for more research, particularly in a Canadian context. And from what I saw in the research, it would be really helpful to look at, instead of just how fair the process can be, it's whether it's having its intended effects or not. So whether it's supporting community members and finding a sense of justice and preventing further gender-based violence on campus. So that is a quick overview of the complaint process.
I love this, talking about this and listening to Robyn talk about it in terms of how we address this. The Courage to Act project, now the next steps for it is really to look at what we're talking about now, taking the recommendations that were brought forward and taking them to the next step. And so that is actually creating webinars and podcast series on gender-based violence in PSIs. It will be 10 communities of practice with PSI and community gender-based violence experts from across Canada, 86 members of the communities of practice, and 40 of those members are from community organizations, 35 are from universities, 10 from colleges, and 2 from CEGEPs. So it's a pretty far-ranging of experts that we have that are going to be looking at creating and building on the recommendations from the Courage to Act report. We're also going to be having a national Skillshare in October 2020, bringing together all the communities of practice and all the staff and project managers to come together. We'll also be creating 3 toolkits, 1 on education, 2, the second one will be on support and response, and the third will be about complaints processes. Each will be piloted in 2021. And if you are an institution in Canada that is interested in piloting it, we'd love to hear from you. And lastly, a knowledge center, recognizing that there is amazing work happening across campuses in Canada, and we need a place to kind of bring them together and listen to each other and learn from each other. And so this will be an opportunity in the Knowledge Center. And I'll leave it to CJ to talk about our amazing project team.
Thanks, Farrah. It's a pleasure to introduce you to our wonderful team. We have representatives from post-secondary institutions who are working within the areas of education, support and response, and the complaints process. We're also have the fortunate opportunity to work with some of our friends who are in community-based organizations and student-based organizations. So I won't go into introducing each individual here, but we do invite you to check out our couragetoact.ca website and our About Us page so that you can get to know us all a bit better. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Farrah, CJ, and Robyn, for sharing your expertise and introducing the report. So now I'd like at this point to invite all our attendees to share any questions you may have, and you can do so by submitting a question via the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen or via the chat box. So I'll give you a few moments now to pose any questions to our panelists. Okay, so I see that we have our first question. And the first question is, when will more webinars be launched? That's a fantastic question. So our webinar series runs monthly. So we will have one webinar each month up until September 2021. We're currently finalizing our webinar topics and our speakers, and that will be posted on our website shortly. So look forward to more webinars. Great, and so our second question is, when is the National Skillshare? Great question. So at present, our National Skillshare is scheduled for fall 2020. We're looking at the last week in October, and more details for that will be available on our website shortly as well. And of course, if you subscribe to our newsletter, you'll be able to get updates about our upcoming webinars and key dates like the launch of our Knowledge Center and the launch of our National Skillshare there as well. Okay, so I'm going to take a quick look at our chat box. And I see that we have our first question in our chat box as well. So I think this question is for all our panelists. So Farrah, CJ, and Robyn, the question is, what was the most surprising result from the consultations for each section of the report?
I think I'll go first with this one. That's CJ. I think one of the pieces that surprised me most in writing this report is really just the reoccurring sentiment I heard from folks doing the work at the front lines, and how there is an overarching feeling that people aren't respected as experts in their work within the post-secondary setting. And I think I heard this unfolding in a few different ways. One where those who are providing the education response and support around sexual violence on post-secondary institutions aren't being brought into conversations that impact them, that impact their work and that impact survivors. So individuals are being hired into position as experts and then not being looked at as the experts that they are within the post-secondary setting. I think the other way in which I heard this unfold was with lack of funding. So many individuals who are working in these positions are working contract work, aren't receiving full benefits, aren't having access to pension plans. And that's a form of precarity, and also an acknowledgement that those who are experts in this work aren't being acknowledged for the great work they are doing, the great experience they are bringing to post-secondary institutions. And I think that's a piece that we need to keep an eye on moving forward.
Great. It's Robyn. I can go next. I think the thing that was the most interesting to hear, is I've mentioned throughout the section, is just the lack of available research we have at this current time about this process. Just hearing that there are community members and staff who are going through this process, but how there's such little research or consensus on how that we should proceed through this process. So it's just really interesting to hear that, especially from the staff who are doing this day in and day out, and how they don't really necessarily have all the resources they need to do their work in a conducive way that is hopefully not harmful for everyone involved. So it's difficult to hear, but also exciting to hear that there is space to do this research. And I'm excited to hear that the working group after this is already looking into some of those really big questions. Right now, looking at trauma-informed and procedural fairness. So it's exciting to hear that hopefully some of these questions will be answered.
And I would lastly, this is Farrah, I would say for me, I think going into this, really thinking about communities and that it's not one size fits all around conversation around support and response. And that really, we saw that in the listening learning sessions, especially listening to folks from rural, remote communities, small universities and CEGEPs and colleges, recognizing that there's not one way to address this, and resources are scarce in some communities. There's not a local sexual assault center maybe for a community, or a rape crisis center, or a shelter. And so really looking at that piece. I think secondly, what I heard and what I really thought was important as well is the need to support people who have caused harm, recognizing that they have their own experiences of trauma that they're bringing to this, and that they also need support. And so that was a really good piece that came out of the conversation for me.
Great, thank you so much, CJ, Robyn, and Farrah. All right, so I think we have another question. And so our fourth question is, recognizing that this is preemptive at this stage, perhaps, how will administrators and decision makers be encouraged to take up the report outcomes as best practice, rather than perhaps doing their own thing?
So in terms of administrators, we have in the advisory committee and in terms of our listening learning sessions have worked really closely with administrators to have conversations about what will work and what will not work, and really getting good feedback around how do we get support and buy-in from administrators around these conversations. And so what we hope to do is continue that in the next phase of the project and continue those conversations to ensure that it's not just frontline workers asking for this, and not just survivors or people that have experienced harm, but it's also people that are at the very high levels in the universities and colleges and CJEPs that can advocate for the need for these kind of toolkits to come in, these conversations to come in, and these kind of assessments to happen.
Great, thank you, Farrah. And also thank you to all our attendees who posed very thoughtful questions. I think we have time for one last question. And that question is, how do you foresee addressing power dynamics in terms of gender-based violence prevention education?
I think that's a CJ here. I think that's a really important question, and I do think it's a reality on post-secondary campuses and in community at large that we do need to tackle. I think when I think about how I think through the approach, I think we need to develop a conscious approach, one that takes many different angles, including education, as well as policy change, in order to invoke social change. So here I'm thinking about, like, what sort of educational opportunities do we need to foster on our campuses so that we can really truthfully have conversations about power dynamics, and the impacts of power dynamics within the setting of a post-secondary institution. I think also many of our campuses have policies that don't overlap, and that maybe sometimes contradict one another. So for example, within existing sexual violence policies, oftentimes a definition of consent will say cannot be given when there's a power relationship, and yet we have a conflict of interest policy that talks about how and when and what steps need to be put in place for if a faculty member is dating a student, for example. So we have some discord currently happening. And I think we need to have these conversations first and foremost, and then strategically look at how we can really support social change on our campus. I also wanted to give a hats off to Students for Consent Culture, who are currently doing a research project exploring power dynamics within a graduate student setting. And I would check out their work for a bit more information about their project. But definitely let's keep that conversation going, and I'm curious if Robyn or Farrah have anything to share.
Great, thank you so much, CJ, for that. That's wonderful. Unfortunately, I think that's all the time we have for questions today, and we've had a wonderfully engaging, informative, and thought-provoking discussion today. And just a note in time, as I really want to honor our 1-hour commitment. Again, Farrah, CJ, and Robyn, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us today. We've learned a lot, and the recording will be available on our website later. I also want to thank our participants for joining us today and for sharing with us today. We really appreciate and take inspiration from your commitment to addressing and preventing gender-based violence on campus. And I speak on behalf of the whole team when we say we're very lucky to be able to work alongside each and every one of you. So thank you again, and a kind reminder to please complete your evaluation forms. And just a note too on our social media handles, you can find us on Twitter at Possibility Seeds, Facebook at Possibility Seeds, LinkedIn Possibility Seeds, and Instagram also at Possibility Seeds. And we look forward to continuing the conversations on there. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you at the next webinar.